So The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is our topic today. And so we're getting into the fictional section of the course, where we're dealing specifically with Lewis's fiction. But my argument throughout, and I've said this from the beginning, but I'm going to repeat it, is that his more academic, apparently unrelated work on topics, even seemingly off topic for him, like education, the abolition of man, or his work in medieval Renaissance literature, The Discarded Image, or even his introduction to 16th century literature, or his work in The Allegory of Love, are all connected in many ways, even in his fiction. And we understand his fiction better, where he's coming from. They're not just material. It's the sense that he's getting at in the character. The characters are thinking along the lines that Lewis himself thought, and express to some degree his judgments upon things. And that's particularly evident in the Narnia Chronicles, which talk about education a lot. It's just like these are school-aged kids, and they make comments about the effects of education on them, and they're not usually very good. And there are sort of comments from the narrator, who is presumably Lewis, but he doesn't say that, but who is the narrator, that are confirming this. And sometimes it's a figure of authority that will make the comment. But Lewis seemingly agrees with the character, or sometimes Aslan makes the same sort of observations, confirming the same point of view. So that's that's why I started with the literary criticism, because most people wouldn't read it. And I think there's much to be gained there. And remember, with The Discarded Image, I think we have to see it as a work of what he calls grammar. It's there to aid us to read things for ourselves. It's foundational stuff. It's funny that you don't think of literary criticism as grammar, but really that's what it is. You need this to be able to do that. And that's, we're not used to hearing that, because in the entertainment industry, they want to sell as many tickets or as many books or whatever as they can. So to do that, they want to eliminate as many. You have to do this first before you do that. And so they reduce it to then things that require no grammar to access it. When I say grammar now, I mean in the applied sense of you have to have understood all these things first before you get to that. But we can't do that at university, or we shouldn't be doing that at university, and that's not how we're approaching this either. You are required to do 2 first-year courses in English and be up. There are certain requirements placed on you to even get into this course. I'm not assuming that you know nothing. I assume that you know certain things. I don't have to explain everything. Otherwise, we have to do a lot more work. But the beginning of this was explaining to you things that you couldn't have known, I don't think, without having read Lewis, about the medieval model on a variety of things, because we're not medievalists. And we no longer look at things that way. We simply don't. And so it doesn't make any sense why characters do certain things in his fiction, other than, okay, they go further up and further in. Why would Aslan call for them to do such a thing? Doesn't make any sense, but that's fine. Characters say all sorts of things that make no sense. But in Lewis's fiction, they all do make sense. That's the point. But the sense isn't there until you know where he's coming from. And it comes against a backdrop as well, and the backdrop is that of modern science and modern education, and he is in disagreement with both of them. And so I wanted to begin by introducing you to a little book, which I think I've introduced you to the topic of education, which is of great interest to me, but also of science. And I'm not a scientist, but I think if you're in the humanities in our day, you have to understand 2 things, particularly after COVID. One is the character of modern medicine, which he addressed, at least on the side, in The Abolition of Man. and the other is what's going on in the sciences, natural science. So this is a really good book by Leon Kass. He was the chair of the bioethics committee under President Bush, W. Bush. And he was a medical doctor for many years, and he left that life to become a humanities professor at a great books college. It was very interesting, but and writes very well, and writes books on Genesis and Exodus and so forth. Very erudite man. This is just the introduction. I'm just going to read this, and you can see where he is going and how much it sounds like Lewis, or at least the interest. Just the introductory paragraph. The promise and the peril of our time are inextricably linked with the promise and the peril of modern science. On the one hand, the spread of knowledge has overcome superstition and reduced fear born of ignorance, and the application of science through technology has made life less poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Quoting Thomas Hobbes there, by the way. As one of my colleagues puts it, before the 20th century, human life was simply impossible. Yet, on the other hand, new technologies have often brought with them complex and vexing moral and social difficulties, and the scientific discoveries themselves sometimes raise disquieting challenges to traditional notions of morality or of man's place in the world. Moreover, thanks to science's contributions to modern warfare, before the end of the 20th century, human life may become literally and permanently impossible. He's thinking about nuclear war. The age-old question of the relation between the tree of knowledge and the tree of life now acquires a special urgency. That's the first paragraph. It's a good book. It's on the topic, and it's a variety of essays that he's written over the years as a medical doctor, as somebody who thinks about the advent of the new medicine and the Hippocratic Oath, and that feature of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, the one that is no longer sworn by doctors. So what's the difference between healthcare and harm? How do you know that you're helping somebody? What is health? Those are actual issues. So where does the doctor intervene? Where does he refrain from intervening out of fear that he's going to harm the patient rather than help the patient? Well, if you don't swear an oath to avoid harm as your first priority, then you might be trying to help the patient but may kill the patient in the process. And you're not going to be bothered by that because it's a grand experiment. And we're going to try it on you, but we won't do it to ourselves. Right? Because there's no ethical boundary there. Similarly, the Nuremberg Code, we talked about that in terms of informed consent and so forth. It was a hallmark of medicine post-World War, which has now been set aside. And one final thing before I launch on this, it occurred to me, somebody asked me, and I don't remember the context, and I don't think it was this class, there's a really interesting flowering of writers in the middle of this period that seem to have similar sorts of interests and concerns. And this book I read a couple years ago now, The Year of Our Lord, 1943, Christian Humanism in an Age of Crisis, talks about a whole series of these writers. And I thought it was an excellent book by Alan Jacobs, who I've benefited much from over the years, but these include Lewis and Tolkien, Charles Williams, and a whole series of other writers. It's very interesting. And they're also writing against the backdrop of modern science and modern medicine and their concerns about it. Some of them have no positive view at all. The George Orwells, the Aldous Huxleys, they're portraying the same problem. But they don't have a positive view of where to go with this. It's very bleak. Whether you're reading Huxley or Orwell, they are sort of resigned and seeing a totalitarian future ahead. Lewis and Tolkien lived through the same times, and they practice what you might see as escapism or imaginative flight to the medieval or distant past, but they seem to be commenting on the present, and I think they are. That's what I think is going on here. It's not just fantasy in the sense of departure from reality. That's why we focused on the importance of story for Lewis as well. Is story just entertainment, or is story connected with the moral nature of humanity? He addressed that specifically. It is exactly the latter. The moral nature of humanity is being evoked in old stories, brought to our attention, commended to us, something that we deeply desire for ourselves. And I've also commented on modern superhero type things and how the superheroes have no moral qualities sometimes. Or if they have them, they're bad moral qualities. They're immoral. Think of Deadpool. This is contemptible. Like, why is he a hero at all? This is bad. So this sort of disgusting character. Likewise, Batman. And Spider-Man, well, he's just a silly boy, basically. And he fights injustice, but does he defend justice? What is justice for him? Is it related to his character? No. But it is in the old stories. It's part of a character. The character's actions are an outflow of their person. Same in Scripture. But enough on that. I wanted to talk about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which we're all looking forward to, so enough of my digression here. And it came after his work, Miracles, which I think you're doing in Dr. Davis's course if you're doing both of our classes. And to some degree, it might have been also focused on a debate he had with Elizabeth Anscombe in the Socratic Society. I think Dr. Davis has talked about that as well, if you're in the class. And a decision that he seems to have made to go back to fiction, which he had forayed into very briefly in the science fiction trilogy that I'll deal with next semester in the 1940s. In the 1940s, he writes science fiction. Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, That Hideous Strength. And in between the second and the third of those volumes, he writes or gives the lecture, The Abolition of Man, which he then writes up. So it's plainly important to the sci-fi trilogy. I still think it's important here as well. But now he's gone back to fiction, and some think it's because he was defeated by Elizabeth Anscombe, and he decided that, he put his tail between his legs and decided he was going to now escape reality and write fiction for a while. I don't think that that's the case at all myself. I think my own opinion on this is that he realized that what was lacking in his contemporaries was what he noticed in students. They were like deserts. They just needed to be watered. So they needed good stories, like the stories he had grown up with and that he loved. They needed to read them. And if they read them, they would be drawn towards the good and the true and the beautiful and the just, because they wanted to live in those worlds themselves. And this was a better apologetic than simply critical arguments could do. In apologetics work, you can strengthen the faith of the faithful, and you can shut the mouths of the critics, but you can't bring the critics to love what you love. That's not what happens. People who are on your side can be strengthened by it. People who are opposed to Christian truth can be silenced, but they aren't persuaded. He wants to persuade them. How do you do that? It's not by controverting what they say and showing that what they're saying is nonsense. I think that's valuable and necessary, by the way, but it doesn't pull people in the right direction. What does is if you present virtue in a attractive way. And that's what he does here. And that's what Tolkien does in his work as well. So in the early spring of 1949, he read aloud to Tolkien the beginning of this book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of air raids. So this is after the war. When he writes this is a few years after the war. But imagining what it would be like. Now, the children are not orphans. I talked about orphans. But they are effectively almost acting like orphans. They don't have any parents to go to. They don't have role models. They're left with, in this case, a strange man, a distant relative. His name is Kirk. I'll say more about him in a bit. Lewis himself said that the immediate cause of this particular book, the first book he wrote in the Narnia Chronicles, was a series of nightmares that he had been having about lions. Who knows why? On a deeper level, he said that it was an answer to the question, what might Christ be like if there really were a world like Narnia and he chose to be incarnate and die and rise again in that world as he actually has done in ours. And so arose the story of 4 children and the great lion. So he begins by being terrified of lions, and then he says, in answer to the question, this is in one of his letters, what might Christ be like if there really were a world like Narnia, this fictional world, and he chose to be incarnate and die? What would he be like then? He would be like that lion that I'm terrified of. And so in that sense, it's just, in a sense, it's very much like his sci-fi trilogy then. It's about Ransom. Elwyn Ransom, rather, who's the hero of that trilogy. What might have happened if the events of the Christian story were presented in the context of a different world, with the lion being the chief figure, the main figure, the figure of terror, of nightmares? Remember the repeatedly say, well, he's not a tame lion. Keep talking about it. This is not a cuddly lion. This is not a lion you trifle with. Something about that. So very, very interesting. One of his biographers, Humphrey Carpenter, who I met at an Oxford pub called the Perch many years ago, by the way. This is years ago. Says that the Narnia stories are entirely in keeping with Lewis and Tolkien's shared belief that story, especially of the mythical type, can in itself give nourishment without imparting abstract meaning. So it's not to be read as an allegory. They have, it is true, a far more specifically Christian coloring than does the Lord of the Rings. Indeed, at times they have something very near a didactic purpose. But so do Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra, and Tolkien had been extremely enthusiastic about those books. Why then did he totally reject the Narnia stories? Because Tolkien hated this, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Didn't like it at all. He did like Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra, and those are very Christian in some ways. How come he didn't like this? Well, you have to speculate. And I think, and he speculates, and I agree with the speculation. I think others have done more or less the same. It's because he didn't like sub-creation where things didn't join up all over the place. In this case, he puts Father Christmas in with the fauns and the dryads and nymphs. And then he throws Bacchus in there as well. The wine, like he just jumbles all of his, like all the figures he can, he throws them in there. And like, what's Father Christmas doing in there? Like, who else do you want to randomly throw into the story? He doesn't like that. It's too hastily written, it's not careful enough, and it doesn't tie in with a whole world. The language, the astronomy, the history, there's nothing there. It's too slapdash. Tolkien just doesn't like it. It doesn't work for him. Whereas when we go to the sci-fi novels, if you're with me next semester, we'll see that there is far greater coherence there. There's a backstory in it, and there's a connection with astronomy, and there's even a reference to languages there, which isn't in these stories at all. It's a different type of genre that he's writing, though, and he's writing here more specifically, I think, with a children's audience in mind. But it's not for kids only. I think he thinks adults will enjoy it, and adults do enjoy it, I think. At least this adult enjoyed it. I thought, this is good. It's not high fiction by any means. It's not to compare with Till We Have Faces as a work of literature. We'll come to that later, which I think is a great work in several ways. But I do think that there is enough there to make us love the good. And I think that's what he wants to achieve in it. So where shall we begin with this? So I began with this because he wrote it first. Even though if you were putting them in a chronological order, you'd put the Magician's Nephew first, because it's the background to it. The man that we call Professor Kirk is actually Diggory from the beginning. And I think we'll have to look at the Magician's Nephew. Maybe we'll even do it next. I don't know. But I think it's helpful to begin where he began. And also consider the idea of the wardrobe, which is the central sort of plot design means to take us from one world to the next. What does it mean to go into a wardrobe there? I mean, it's just there in the attic of his relative's row house. He goes through they're all connected together, and they're clambering through, and they break into it, and they're in the room, and they hear a noise, and they close themselves. But I mean, you imagine yourself as a child hiding, pretending, right? They're at that age as well, where their imaginations are so vivid that they can almost live in that. You can see kids do that, and there's a certain age when they want to make believe is good for them, and it comes readily to them. And then there's a certain age where make believe, they don't want to do that anymore. It's just not enjoyable. They see it as a flight from reality rather than an embrace of reality. And Lewis thinks that the children, he agrees with the Romantics on this, Wordsworth and Blake, that children in some ways, by this imaginative act of play acting, are in some ways exercising an ability that is necessary to see the world, particularly the modern world, the way it ought to be seen. So, because if you think about that make-believe, the kids have superpowers, right? They do things they can't do. They're either animals themselves, or they have magical powers, and there are always fights, and there's good guys, there's bad guys. They are in that imaginative framework, which is the same one that, because of the tendency of modern education, they have debunked and says that's about your values or your feelings, but it's not about the factual world. So they debunk it and say that is unimportant. And what the kids do is unimportant there. Lewis says, no, it's extraordinarily important, and it remains important even after we grow up and say that's no longer important. So he's pushing into that. And he's also saying that this sort of way of looking at things ought to be embraced still by adults, which Wordsworth also says, by the way. All the Romantics thought this, that the children in some ways are exemplary because they have this ability to imagine things in a moral way. And their sense is that moral imagination was getting killed off by the scientific worldview. And they're right. It was being killed off purposefully in the name of science. So that's where he begins with it. And the wardrobe then is just a prop for bringing us into a place where that seemed like it was in the past, where there were fauns and dryads and naiads and nymphs and talking lions and talking beasts, but also a medieval world of chivalry. So chivalry reigned there, and this is interesting. Chivalry is dead. People complain. It is in our day. There isn't a sense of honor, the honor that goes with the chevalier, the knight, rescuing the damsel in distress, etc. Note that Lewis doesn't really go the damsel in distress route. The women get in the battles. They're not in the battles in the same way that the men are, but they're still in the battles. They're not just waiting around for the knights to rescue them. They're not trapped in the tower. So, I mean, Lewis gets accused of being, very old-fashioned in his views, but he actually has the girls fighting with arrows from a distance for sure, but they are actually involved in the fight. That's interesting. You wouldn't get that in the medieval period. So interesting just on that note. But there is a code of honor, and the code of honor is taken to be of high seriousness. It's not just antiquarianism. The children immediately grasp what's at hand. It fits their way of looking at things. Lewis will talk about this when he, in Mere Christianity, talks about the sense that children have of fairness and unfairness. When somebody takes something from them that didn't belong to them from another child, and the child says to the other, that's not fair. And he says, where does this sense of fairness come from? Why does one child bother saying to the other child, that's not fair? Lewis speculates, and I think he's correct, that it's because the child is saying to the other child, you know the difference between right and wrong just as I do, and I'm just telling you that you violated that sense of rightness and wrongness. And they expect the other child to understand. They don't have to explain it to them. They both know that was wrong. Well, in Narnia, they have not accepted the premises of modern sciences that those judgments about good and bad, beautiful and ugly are redundant. In fact, they are fully at work. Everyone accepts it in this world. And the reason that people love that world is because that is a more human world. And so we're also going to want to talk about the presence of magic in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the White Witch, and what's being said there, because recall what we said in early on when we were talking about what Lewis said about magic in his introduction to 16th century literature, that the medieval period is largely devoid of magic. It arises more or less concurrently with modern science. As modern science expresses a desire to gain control over nature and make it work for us, there's a simultaneous desire to use magic to gain control over the world and make it work for us. It's the same impulse. It's the same impulse. So we don't see huge concerns with magic in the medieval period. They don't have the same desire to control nature because they see themselves connected to nature. There's a moral universe and they're a part of it and they live in that reality. So I think this is very interesting. And Lewis writes to his, the famous episode in 1931 where Lewis walks with Hugo Dyson and Tolkien, and they talk to him about Christianity being a true myth. I think Dr. Davis has talked about this. This was the famous episode that he recounts in his sort of spiritual autobiography, where they explain to him that Christianity is a true myth, and he reflects on this and he thinks about this, and what he writes to his friend to explain what he learned, particularly about the atonement. This is relevant because the atonement takes place in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right, where the lion gets put on the stone table and killed, and then breaks the table, cracks, and he rises up and so forth. He says this: what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this, that if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. And again, that if I met the idea of God sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much and was mysteriously moved by it. Again, that the idea of the dying and reviving God, whether it's Balder in Norse mythology, or Adonis in Greek, or Bacchus, again in Greek, similarly moved me, provided I met it anywhere except in the Gospels. But when I heard it in the Gospels, I rejected it. And I thought, this is repugnant. How come? Why do you love it here? And why do you reject it as nonsense and superstition here? Why is that? Why do you react against it so strongly? This is inconsistent. The reason was that in the pagan stories, I was prepared to feel the myth as profound and suggestive of meanings beyond my grasp, even though I could not say it in cold prose what it meant. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with tremendous difference that it really happened. And one must be content to accept it in the same way that he received the earlier mythologies. It's delightful, it's moving, it's mysterious, and it has one addition: it's true. And why did he reject the truth of it? Because he was following the fact-value distinction, which he rejected because he had been moved by his culture to become a man without a chest, even though he wasn't a man without a chest. I'm saying this, not him saying this here. But he says, remembering that it is God's myth where the others are men's myths, i.e. the pagan stories are God expressing himself through the minds of poets. This is a further addition, by the way. Using such images as he found there, while Christianity is God expressing himself through real things. So, what is the significance of ancient mythology, of Norse mythology, of Greek mythology, of Roman mythology? It's also God speaking, he says. It's not just in nature, in the understanding of the laws of physics that God speaks. It's also in the old mythologies. God is speaking through the poets. And really interestingly, their myths all talk about things that sound very Christian at points. Not without, some of them do at any rate. And he mentions 3, Balder, Adonis, and Bacchus. Bacchus is torn apart, by the way, and he's revived every year. So there's a death, an atonement, and a resurrection. Those are there. He thinks they're extraordinarily moving passages when he reads them as mythology. When he comes to the gospel accounts, he wants to read them as history, devoid of mythology, but then he fails to appreciate them. So you almost have to read them as myths, but true myths. That was a turning point for him. And the comment from Jacobs is the extent to which he had made Tolkien's ideas about myth and truth his own can be seen in the claim in the same letter that the doctrines we get out of the true myth are of course less true. They are translations into our concepts and ideas of what God has already expressed in a language more adequate, namely the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. That is, the language of actual historical event, such as can be narrated in mythical form, is a more truthful language than the language of concepts and ideas. Why doesn't God just give us theology? That's what you get from churches. That's what you get from universities. You get things explained in terms of substitutionary atonement and so forth. Useful, necessary terms. That's not how we have it presented there in the gospel accounts. It's not even the narrative of it, it's recording historical events. God is telling us a story. He's living out the story. So when in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan is slain on the stone table, taking the place of Edmund. Let's come back to Edmund in a minute. Why is it Edmund? Because it is Edmund. And Susan and Lucy are wandering about in the field not knowing what to do. They hear a crack as if a giant had broken a giant's plate. It's the table broken in half. And then the girls hear a voice. And it's the voice of the risen lion. Yes, it is more magic. He calls it magic. What sort of magic? What sort of magic? Next semester we'll look at Merlin in the stories of the sci-fi trilogy. He emerges in the 3rd installment of it. It's really odd. And we know Merlin is a magician in Arthur's court, but he isn't a bad guy in Lewis's rendition. He works with nature. He's not sure what side he's on at first. He's a very mysterious figure. He's going to work with magic, but magic now is meant in a profound sense of sympathy with the way things ought to be and have been created. And then he goes back and explains, if the witch had been able to look back before the dawn of time, she would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in the traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. By the way, the kids don't even comment on the explanation. I'm not even sure if they know what to make about it. But the reader takes it. The children just, you would have thought they'd ask questions at this. This is an extraordinary revelation. It's giving a metaphysical explanation for what's just happened. And like if the witch had been able to go back before the dawn of time, she would know that there was another law at work here. And the other law at work is what? That God has prepared a sacrifice before the foundation of the world. Right? That's not presented in Genesis. That's told about far later, I believe, by Peter. Redemption was planned before creation. So God knew what was going to happen. Did he therefore cause the fall? Well, those are all different questions. But there was a sacrifice, a lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world. It's not meant temporally. It's meant in the sense that God had in mind a solution to the problem that would arise from human freedom, etc., and prepared a lamb, just like he did with Abraham when he put his son Isaac to be slain, and then the ram was caught in the thicket, etc. There was a sacrifice that was prepared, just like he did when he clothed Adam and Eve with the skins. Right? There was a sacrifice planned long before that. So this is a deep commentary on it within that text. I find it profound. Any comments or questions here before I move on? I went right to the heart of the story, which is that moment at the stone table, right? And the witch is desperate to get all four of the children, to get them all. If they can get them all, then it will, she'll be able to stop what she knows is going to happen. She'll be able to do it, and she can kill them all. Right? She's got Edmund, but I want you to bring your brothers and sisters. They all have to be here, because if I can do that, then the prophecy about the children will be prevented. I can stop that. So there's a lot of sense of in here, which we don't get, let's say in Game of Thrones, or not Game of Thrones, but the Rings of Power and so forth. There's a sense of determinism, prophecy, and fulfillment, and the need to do that. It's being pressed on by a motive that transcends that of the human characters in it. There's a sense of being pulled into a story. You're living your life, but you're pulled into a story that transcends you, and you become a part of that story, and you didn't even know there was a story. But now you know you've been given a purpose and a meaning that you didn't know just by living your life. Somebody had to inform you that that was happening. And you loved stories, but how did they connect to your life? That's what the importance of the gospel is for Lewis and the rest of us who are Christians, is that this story has a real life application, and we've just been dropped into a story ourselves. So we're living in that same story. That's what happens to the kids when they pass through the wardrobe. They're dropped into a story that is not a digression from their lives. It provides their lives outside of Narnia with meaning and purpose. And note when they go, and this is an interesting aspect of going into the wardrobe, they get older very quickly. They get stronger. They grow up. And they're treated as adults in the story. And they act as adults. They become more and more. So at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we actually see them, and the boys have beards, and they speak like knights in a medieval story with funny ways of speaking, right? And they're hunting a stag. That's what a medieval. What else do you do as a medieval king? You go for a stag hunt, and then they see that lantern, and it reminds them of something, and they're surprised. They can't remember exactly what it was. They start pushing through, and then they find themselves back in the wardrobe, and then they're back to being children. Well, what do you do with that then? But what they have there is a sense of their moral being, which is there in just like a very microscopic form when they were children in this world during the Blitz, now filled out to what they could be if their potential were fulfilled and all of their good features were amplified and all of their bad features were done away with. This is a sort of an eschatological vision. And then they get thrown back to this world. And are they changed by that experience? And the answer is yes. They are different characters. They can't forget Narnia. In fact, they keep thinking about it. They're thinking about what they will be, but they no longer see it as an escape from reality. They see it as, this is the way I'm meant to be, and I now live in a world where I can't live that way because the rest of the world doesn't understand it, whereas there, they all understood it. So if you want to take it as a, what's the didactic purpose of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? It's to equip Christians to live in this world that denies all of the moral virtues that were honored and fought for and lived out as if there was nothing more true than that in the realm of Narnia, and then come back in that because, not because it's going to make them better people, but because that is the way that things really are. So there's the two cities. They were in the real city where there's no contradiction there. There was no denial of that. Now they're going to get dropped into the world where all of those things are regarded as nonsense, where the educators are going to say, you need to debunk that. And so it is for children, but it's for Christian children. Or children who have the stirrings of virtue in them that would like to be better than they are, and the world to be better than they are. And they don't have to do it through make-believe. They can really be that thing that they wish they would be. That's my sense there. And I also think this is what Christian education is there to do, ultimately, is to equip you to live. So how ought things to be? We don't need to speculate. We see in the book of Revelation how those things ought to be. There will be no more death, nor sickness, nor sin, nor dying, or tears. All those things will be wiped away. The nations will bring their gifts to God, who's come down to meet his bride, the heavenly Jerusalem. The gates are open. The leaves are for the healing of the nations. That's how things will be. And in a sense, they already are, which is why we say the Lord's Prayer. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's already done that way. It will be that one way without contradiction. Let's make it without contradiction right now. So he's doing the same sort of thing, and he's doing it with the language of just a child's story. It's really interesting that the youngest child is the one who goes there first and who always gets it better than the older children. That's really interesting. And she understands above all the rest of them how important it is to be with Aslan. The older children, the older they are, the more they think they can do it on their own. Lewis is not being mean to the older children. He's not condemning Susan for being interested in makeup. It seems like Susan didn't make it here. Like the last battle, Susan's not here. What? Because she was interested in makeup and boys? Like, what's wrong with you, Lewis? That seems a little bit mean. That's not what I think it's misrepresenting what he's doing there. In the last battle, he's not making an eschatological pronouncement on the final destination of that character of Lucy. He's saying she has no interest in this anymore. But Lucy always does. She leads the way. And it's because it's easier for small children to live in a world the way it ought to be than the way it actually is. It's just easier. They're inclined to it. They accept things very simply, without too much criticism, unless they are educated to disabuse themselves of that. And even then they rebel against it when they're not in the classroom. And they'll play, which is a form of rebellion without them intentionally rebelling. It's their souls are rebelling against the conformity of the conditioners. How about the character of Edmund? Do you want to deal with the character of Edmund? Edmund's a really interesting character and a not likable character at all. Much like Eustace Scrubb, we will find. But he's even more dislikable, actually, insofar as his treachery is greater. He betrays his brothers and sister, or his brother and sisters. And he does it for what? Turkish delight. Like, what's with that? You ever had Turkish delight? Like, of all the things. I guess it tasted good to somebody at some point. Not me, not for my taste. Anyway, whatever. My son, when we read this, he really wanted Turkish delight. Think, oh, I really want to. And they had it. It was like, yuck. This is not nearly as good as I hoped it would be. But he is the product of his school. And he was prone to these sorts of interactions with his brothers and sisters. And there was some suggestion that he was mean in the school ground as well. He would beat down the kids that were weaker than him. And I don't think Lewis is commenting what he is commenting on in the Abolition of Man there. I think he's commenting on the public school system as in the private school system there in Britain. And Lewis himself was sent to a school like this. It's called Malvern, which he absolutely loathed. He loathed it. If you don't know it, Lewis lost his mother when he was young. And his father didn't know how to handle the two boys, Jack and Warnie. He sent them to school because he had the means to do it. He was a lawyer. And he meant well by it. I want my kids to be well educated. Obviously, he can't do it on his own, and there's nobody to do it, so I'll send them away. The British often do this. They send their kids to boarding school. I think it's a barbaric practice myself, but it happens. Much harm is done to the children, to their affections, when you send the kids away. But that's what happened to him. Now, he doesn't blame his father too much, but it does have an effect. His father seemed like a compassionate man, actually. But Malvern, he did not like it one bit. And the way it works, which I think it still does to this day, but it's particularly pronounced in the English private schools, is that there are boys that are good at sports. And there are boys that aren't good at sports. And by the way, they're single sex, so you don't have to deal with that issue. But the boys that aren't good at sports basically got pounded by the boys that are good at sports, humiliated, whatever. And Lewis wasn't good at sports. He had 2 left feet, probably 2 left-handed, couldn't catch, whatever. Right? And the school tends to be run in a hierarchical way. There's a head boy as well. And it's supposed to be modeled on a virtue system, but the head boy represents all of the goods of the school. Right? This is our best student, and he's a model for all the others, but unfortunately, when it goes to pot, it's more like Lord of the Flies. You have the toughest boy and the cruelest boy being the head boy, and there's this in a hierarchy, and they just basically beat down. And I've seen in schools that still happens to some degree. I don't think they try and eradicate it, but bullying is a part of human nature. It's not a good part of human nature, but it's there. And Lewis experienced that in Malvern. And I think when he portrays Edmund, he's thinking of Edmund as one of the bullies. So he's not thinking of the abolition of man and the effect of a certain type of education. That will be used to scrub. There he's talking about that when he comes to Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And used to scrub, he talks about him as a progressive school, progressive education. He called his parents by their first names, and they were all very progressive, and they wore certain clothes, and they believed certain... Okay, but that's not Edmund. Edmund is more a bully like he experienced growing up and hated. So he hated this boy. He had bad associations of this boy. And this boy went along with Lucy, or heard what Lucy said, because Lucy went ahead, and the character of Mr. Tumnus, having met Lucy, encouraged her to go back and bring her 3 siblings back. Because he immediately said, "What, you're a human child?" There's a story about a human child, and I was told, if I ever met one of these human children, that I ought to immediately bring them to the White Witch. And he's doing it out of cowardice, for which he is gravely sorry. But she goes back, tells Edmund, and Edmund mocks her. And he ridicules the imaginative world that she lives in and says it didn't happen. Even when he goes there and comes back and knows it real, he betrays her and lies about it and so forth. So he's a thoroughly contemptible boy, not likable in the least. And does it for the incentive of Turkish delight. But what is a Turkish delight? Is there magic in it? Well, there apparently seems to be. It has a power over him. Who knows what's in it, if anything? He wants more. He wants all that he can eat. It seems to be representative of some sort of vice more than anything. And the more he eats it, the worse he is, and he can only think about that thing, and he's totally controlled by it. It's more about power and control than anything else. So it's a representative of his particular sin being exercised, and when he eats it, it's a bit like the ring of power. It distorts him as well. And he starts imagining that he was, and the White Witch encourages this, I will put you in charge of your brother, because he says initially, she says, oh yes, I'll bring you all back and you all be kings and queens. And he says, he doesn't like that much. He wants to be on, oh no, of course you will be. And the White Witch even encourages him that she almost has romantic feelings towards him, which the young boy doesn't quite know what to do with. But he sort of likes, because she's beautiful. And he doesn't, as a boy, he's not really that, but I mean, there's part of him that is aware of that, but he's not like he's in his teens, like his late teens, where he's an adult and, attractive women. He's not, but there's enough there at this stage where it's awakening in him. And he likes the idea of being in power over the rest. That's one of his conditions. And the fact that they will be king and queen together, he really likes that idea. Not quite sure what that means, but I like that idea. I'll be in charge, and I'll be able to tell Peter in particular what to do. He wants to tell Peter what to do. He doesn't care about the girls. But Peter, why? Because Peter probably did the same sort of things that he beats down. He's the older brother. He probably gives him a good whacking every once in a while, like brothers, siblings do, right? So Edmund is this a more or less despicable character who betrays his siblings And it's funny that the siblings are not even aware that he could or would do that. But Mr. Beaver and Mrs. Beaver immediately say he's a traitor and he did do this. And the kids mount a defense on their brother's behalf. No, he couldn't. He wouldn't do that, but they know in their hearts he did. They know it. They just don't want to say it. And then the plot progresses. Because at this point they also notice something extraordinary happening, which is the snow is melting. And then they introduce this sort of absurd character of Father Christmas coming along, and where it's always winter and never Christmas. How terrible. Where there's always the consequence of sin, but there's never any story of redemption. That's what this is a symbol for. There's no incarnation, there's no redemption, but it's always winter. In Dante, which Lewis read, in hell, it was very cold. A winter landscape is a hellish landscape. It's inhospitable, it's very difficult to survive in it. It's there in Dante, and it stays in Western literature after that. By the way, it's there in Russian fiction, even Canadian fiction to some degree. The winter is not without symbolism. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. When you go to the Arctic, even in this contemptible Rings of Power series at the end, when they're going up and they're clambering up, and it's icy, and it's like, yeah, this is hell. They're in hell. And that's exactly what it's being portrayed there. It is an awful place. They're going to the ends of the earth. And Galadriel, represents a figure that is, to some degree, become hellish. She's driving her men there, or the elves, and they're on the brink of dying, and she doesn't care. Sort of she represents toxic masculinity, I said. It's an extraordinary thing. So, it all comes down to magic and the stone table and the cracking the stone table. You might think, in response to the question, is it magic, that Aslan would say, no, it's not magic, it's reality. But he says, yes, it's more magic. It's a deeper magic. It's the magic that lies behind the magic. But this magic is not devoted to power, it's devoted to giving up power. He doesn't say that, but I'm saying it, that he is sacrificing. He's letting himself be the equivalent of crucified. There's a power that's working itself out through weakness. In conformity with the law, and yet it's not under the law. And because he's a willing sacrifice and he didn't commit any treachery, the law will not hold him. And anybody who's a Christian immediately, it's like, there's so many resonances here. But the reference to magic doesn't really work until you understand the word gospel in English has this same sense. In Greek, it's evangelion. The word there for gospel is evangelion, the good news. Oi, the EU in Greek, and the angelos is the news or messenger. And translated into English, it's the gospel. It's the good spell. A spell has the idea of magic and also a story. The word spell, a spell is a story. And this is a good story, but it's also a good spell. It has a power to it that brings the dead sinner to life. We still have this when we talk about the gospel. It follows the rules of the world, follows the laws of the world even, and yet it doesn't, because it is a deeper magic that breaks the magic power spell that leaves us in a place where it's always winter and never Christmas. But then Christmas comes. Comments or questions about that? Okay, my question is, what do you want me to talk about that I haven't talked about in this Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? I have my own ideas of what I want to talk about, but I only have 15 minutes or so. So is there anything that you would like me to discuss here? No? Okay. So, what's with all of these different characters that get dropped into the plot then? Again, the Father Christmas, I guess that's sort of obvious. He's not Santa Claus. The British call him Father Christmas. There are different associations. But he does come to bring presents in the light of the incarnation, of course. Who else appears? Bacchus appears. Suddenly, I'm surprised Balder doesn't show up. I guess that would probably be too much. He probably took pity on Tolkien. So I'm not going to throw him in there as well, because as a Norse professor, you will kill me to throw Balder in there as well. But we throw all these associations with gods who are killed and come back to life. They start appearing. So the old myths that pointed to the true myth are all showing up at the same time and showing us that all stories ultimately point to the story. And that's where they get their meaning. He's commenting on literature then, there. It's very subtle, but that's what he's doing. He's commenting on the use of the old stories that we love to read. They are all connected to this story in the same way for Lewis. As a literature professor, the stories that he loved were connected to the real story that took place in Bethlehem, the babe of Bethlehem. So I commented on Lucy seeing Aslan first. How about Edmund then? Because Edmund is a traitor. The characters that are with Aslan despise Edmund as well. There's a detestation amongst the whole crew for Edmund. Understandably so. And the story doesn't end when Aslan is raised up. Then there's a big battle that ensues as well. What's going on with that? Because you would have thought the battle's been won at this point, right? He rises from, but then a battle ensues. What's with that? Why does a fight happen? And how about the rehabilitation of Edmund? By the way, the name Edmund is a particularly black character from King Lear. He's the villain. There's a good brother named Edgar, and the villain's named Edmund, and Edmund is a traitor, and a particularly evil one at that. But what's going on with that? Well, first of all, Aslan speaks to Edmund, and Edmund, because he's died for Edmund, the worst of the characters, he's died for him. And he seems to represent, and Aslan makes this abundantly clear, what he did represents everything that the rest of you did as well. In some ways, there's an aspect to what he did which you all would have done, and could have done, and ultimately did do in your hearts. So there's it's not just atoning for this one character, it's for all of them. So when they're looking at Edmund and despising him, he's correcting their misunderstanding of the situation. It wasn't only Edmund who was the traitor, you all were traitors. And he's the worst of them in your eyes, but not in Aslan's eyes. And by resurrecting, in his opinion, the worst of them, forgiving him, he's also forgiving those who are less egregious in their sins. And there's nobody then that Aslan cannot redeem. Because they see it of him, they think this is wonderful. And then you hear the news, but it's also for the rest of you. But if you can forgive him, then you can also forgive me. So that story gets brought home. That it's very important, that passage then. And then you notice the transformation of Edmund as a character as well. He flips, comes completely different. We see the exact same thing with Eustace Scrubb, right? Who starts as a contemptible character because of his upbringing, because of his education, and then becomes a very different character. There he gets, first of all, made into a dragon. Well, in a different way, Edmund's a sort of a dragon. He's a nasty character. But then he suddenly becomes Edmund. Edmund the what? What's he called? What's the appellation for him? Do you recall? Edmund the Just. How can he be the just? What was just about Edmund? Did he do anything to deserve that title? I can't see anything in the story that would lead to that name, Edmund the Just. You might want to think about a biblical story. Peter is Simon. He gets called the Rock. What has Peter shown in his life that will merit the name Petros, which means the rock? Because he's Simon. That's a reed. It breaks. It's fragile. It bends with the breeze. That's what he was like before. Jesus calls him, you're no longer Simon, you're Peter. You're the rock. What did he do to deserve the name? Absolutely nothing. He will be just after that. So he's going to live up to the name that he's given. The name is given to him. It's not because he has been just. It's because he will be just, because he's been made just. And before he was unjust. He was unjust towards his siblings. He was unjust towards Aslan. In fact, he was unjust towards everybody. He was always trying to be on the top and beating everyone down. And now he's going to be the opposite going forward. So he names him the way he is and will henceforth be. So there's a transformation that goes with that name. It sounds like he doesn't deserve it. That's because he doesn't deserve it. But he will deserve it, because there is a transformation, a literal transformation that goes on with him. After this, Edmund is a thoroughly likable character. When we revisit him in Prince Caspian, it's he who, when they're talking about where did Aslan go, and they all think he went there, and Susan says, it's this way. Nobody believes him. Edmund said, I once did this, and I'm with Lucy here, because she said it. I'm with my sister. This is just, right? He didn't see Aslan. He said, but if she said it, I'm going to believe her. Peter said, let's go up there. Everybody else, okay, if Peter said it, we're with Peter. No, not that. Very moving. Restored relationships between the siblings as they probably ought to be. But they didn't deserve those good relations. They've been given them because they have a new nature. So lots going on there. I think it's extraordinary. And as I say, very moving. Illustrations of Christian discipleship on Lewis's part in the stories. It's very unrealistic in the human sense. People don't become like that overnight. But I guess in stories they can. In Lewis's story, the story follows the theology of Scripture about what happens when somebody's been born again. Note the lion breathes on them as well. So, breathes on their faces, and they are given this life. Edmund does as well. So there's a talk, there's a confession, there's some tears. He breathes on him. He's new. But then they still have to fight. So what's with the fight? Now the fight, it really depends a great deal on your view of warfare. And this is after the Second World War. He was in the trenches in the First World War. He lost many friends, not as many as Tolkien. Tolkien lost all of his friends there, I think except for one. But he saw modern warfare as it was, not as the medieval works of chivalry, a knight going up, tilting at another knight, where the most virtuous would win. So it is presented. in King Arthur and his court, they are more concerned with their inner state than with their outer state. The one whom God most favors is going to win this fight. Does anyone go into the First and the Second World War with that mindset? Doesn't look like it. They have an understanding that virtue alone doesn't win you fights, in part because human sin remains a problem, even for the virtuous, and that's part of the lesson of King Arthur. Sin is still there. Camelot is not the New Jerusalem. As much as it would aspire to be, it fails to achieve that. They have even more reason, because in the First World War, there are Christians on both sides of the conflict. The Germans are being encouraged by their pastors to go for war, to war for fatherland and country, for progress. And on the Allies' side, same thing from pulpits. Go on into the battle, because the virtuous, the one who's on God's side, is going to win the fight. But they both, if you look at that, and there are, I forgot to bring that today. There's a good historian who wrote on the sort of the First World War context for Lewis and Tolkien's fiction. It's a very good book. I'll bring it next time if I can remember. I think that stays with them. This idea, though, that the pastors encouraged them to go into a battle thinking that the war would be over swiftly and that their side would be victorious. And they found out in trench warfare they fought for 4 years over a little patch of mud. And at the end of it said, why on earth did this ever happen? They're not even clear why so many millions died. And so many families lost their sons and their husbands. And then the Spanish flu came and took them out. And then they went back into it in the Second World War with the same sides, more or less, only even more atrocious. The machines were more developed, and war was not a matter of virtue or valor, seemingly, so much as the desperate need to prevail over the enemy, who was more wicked than your side was, which was also wicked. Remember Lewis's Abolition of Man? He's talking about progressive education. He's talking about Britain. He's not talking about Nazi Germany. It would have been true of Nazi Germany. It's also true of Britain, though. So he's not saying our side is virtuous. Those guys are of the devil. He's, in a sense, saying we're all of the devil. Will he still say that they should go to war? He will. And so will Tolkien. They have to fight because there are worse things. And so he plunges them into battle here. They're not without... Now, this is a world of... This is Narnia. And the White Witch doesn't represent Germany, and the kids represent England. It's not that simplistic. Here it is sort of a good versus evil thing. Of course they're going to win. But he does have in mind that 2 world wars have just been fought, and he supported the war both times because there was no resistance within the Germans to this. They had allowed Hitler to take over, and they couldn't stop it. And there was at least something good on their side, although it needed to be addressed as well. That's hence the treatise on education. But no sense of the way the battle transpires in Narnia being a sort of allegory or even a commentary on the 2 world wars. That's not there. But still, the necessity to resist evil, that's there. That's what the battle's about. It's about resisting evil. And he still held to that. Same in The Lord of the Rings. I know that there are pacifists, Anabaptists that don't agree with war and so forth. And much of what they say, particularly about modern warfare, has some merit, it seems to me. But the alternative of letting bad people get their way is far worse than not fighting at all. Better not to do it with weapons. Better to try and use the means that God's provided that are short of war. But if it comes to it, I guess Would you rather have Hitler in charge? And that's what it comes down to, Mr. Hitler. Anyway, anything else? Because I think we're... So, what do you want to hear next? Do we want to go to the magician's nephew? That's what I was thinking. Okay, I see nodding of heads, so I'll take that as agreement.